G'day and welcome back to the channel. So in today's video, I want to show you how you can permanently loosen tight groin or adductor muscles. And what I'd like to touch on in the video is I obviously want to show you one of the best ways to mobilize tight groin muscles that I've seen clinically as a physiotherapist. But as I've been doing with a few of the videos in this series, if we're not also trying to figure out why those tight groin muscles have become tight in the first place, then it's unrealistic to expect them to permanently loosen forever. So let's get into it. So the very first thing that we need to touch on before we get into the video is that we need to establish an initial baseline of how tight your groin muscles feel, so that when we get to the underlying cause of that tightness and then eventually show you how to stretch out those groin muscles effectively, you have an obvious baseline you can keep coming back to see what each of these exercises actually does for you. And for me, one of the simplest ways to get a sense of how tight your groin muscles feel is with a groin muscle stretch. So for me, if you can sit down on the floor, you can do this in standing as well if it works better for you. But if you can tuck one of your legs underneath you and have your leg at about a 45-degree angle, we can then essentially lean forwards as far as you feel comfortable until you feel a genuine level of tightness in those groin or adductor muscles. We don't necessarily want you to lean off to the side, but by leaning forwards, it's a great way to understand how far you feel you can go. This position is a great way to keep your back straight and hinge forward as far as you feel happy to go. And for the purposes of this video, this is as far as I feel comfortable before I feel a genuine strong tightness through my groin muscles. It's important that we hinge forward from our hips and not from our back, because for me, I can get to a point where I feel my tightness here, but if I bend my back, I can get a lot further on top of that, but I'm not adding anything extra into the stretch. So being up nice and tall, hinging forward from your hips until you find that tightness. Take a mental note of how far you feel you're going, and then we're going to come back to this when we get to these next exercises. So once you've established that initial baseline, we need to start a conversation about why those groin muscles have become tight in the first place. And the really interesting thing that I've found as a physiotherapist over the last 20 years is that everything has to happen for a reason. Musculoskeletally, if you have tight musculature anywhere, that is often a request for support or help or stability from something else. So if you're just stretching your groin muscles on their own and hoping that that'll solve your groin muscle tightness, then you may never be getting underneath that or getting to the step before that that's asking those groin muscles to be tight. And for me, clinically as a physiotherapist, there's often two main reasons why groin muscles become tight. The first is hip joint restrictions, and the second is lower back dysfunction. It's also important to bring strength training into the mix here. The stronger your core is, the stronger your hip muscles are, especially the glutes on the outside of the hip. They will go a long way in creating an optimal environment for those groin muscles to function normally. You may also need to do some groin muscle strengthening just to try and replace some of that tightness with muscular strength. But for the purposes of this video, I'm going to focus on the mobility restrictions that often underpin the cause of this tightness. I'll touch on some individual strength exercises quickly towards the end of the video, but clinically for me, I find that getting through some of those hidden restrictions gives the most permission back to your groin muscles to feel looser long term. So the first place I want to start is we're actually going to start at your lower back. The reason being is that the lower back and specific segments of the lower back around the base of your rib cage and the top of your lumbar spine, if they become unknowingly stiff, tight, restricted, or overloaded, there's neural tissue and neural connections at that level of your spine that tell your groin muscles what to do. So if that section of your back becomes dysfunctional in its own right, with or without overt pain attached to it, but hidden restrictions and dysfunctions in that part of your back can ask your groin muscles to tighten up to help compensate or as a compensation in its own right. And it's always good to start with the lower back, because if we can show you how to free up those sections of your lower back, you come back to this groin muscle stretch and you feel an instant change in that flexibility, then you'll know instantly that that part of your back was meaningful and should be a focus that you have going forwards to try and give this the best chance of never wanting to tighten once again. So again, establish your baseline, see how it feels through your groin to begin with, and then with a lacrosse ball or a foam roller, what I'd like you to do is you want to go looking for some of the stiffness, as I said, not right at the base of your spine, but at the base of your rib cage and the top of your lower back. So with your foam roller, we can place the roller in that part of your back. And then as we always do on the channel, you have a lot of options here. We can get you to place your hands behind your neck, and just cradle back over the stiff spot that you feel. You can gently move the roller up or down, looking for the main spot that feels the most restricted for you. I don't want you to roll up and down, because what we're trying to do here is we're trying to affect the joint dysfunction or any joint restriction. They're very segmentally specific areas of your spine. And if you're rolling up and down them, you're never getting enough individual, consistent, specific pressure through those joints to ask them politely to free up. So again, how that looks is once you've found a spot that feels a little bit stiff and rusty for you, we then want to double check which side feels the most stiff or rusty. And again, for me, it is this sort of left-hand side. And then what I'd like to do is once you've found that, you just want to drop your shoulders back as far as you feel happy to. You're welcome to have pillows and cushions here so you can relax. Or if you want to do it the other way around, you can rest your head on the ground, lift your hips up. Again, find the level that feels the most restricted, and then just gently drop your hips down to find that tension. Take a couple of deep breaths. Make sure you relax in this position, and then just give the tissue a chance to change. Once you've spent 30 seconds or a minute in this shape, then just move the roller up a little bit or down a little bit. Go looking for anything and everything that you feel is stiffer and tighter than it might be. And again, remember, if one side feels stiffer, the other side feels more tender or more uncomfortable, we want you to prioritize the side that feels the hardest and the most restricted. So for me, that was the same side. The most tender side was the most restricted side, but just double check that it's not the opposite for you. So once you spend some time working up and down each segment of your spine, trying to clear free any of that restricted tissue that may be there, then immediately come back to the same position that you're in before, up nice and tall, hinging those hips forwards. And again, for me, it automatically feels like there's less tightness in that area, but I feel like I can go further and further before I then start to notice that tightness. Now, obviously we're gonna get to an important groin muscle stretch because we still need to politely ask this tissue to go away specifically. But as you'll hopefully find immediately after working through your lower back restrictions, you may then automatically feel that little bit looser through your groin muscles straight away. And if you do, let me know in the comments down below, because that can often be a little surprising to people or a little bit confusing. But again, if you think of your spine as the switchboard that has a lot of the nerves, which is the wiring that supplies all the tissue in your arms and legs, yes, you can have an isolated issue in the area that you're having dysfunction where your groin muscle has tightened up. But if we're not also checking the fuse box to see what also might be contributing to that, then we could be missing the biggest piece of the puzzle and all the context needed to truly understand why a groin muscle is tightened in the first place and what you may need to address to permanently loosen it going forwards. So again, let me know how that went for you. So as I mentioned before, the second aspect of groin muscle tightness that I think often gets overlooked is hip joint dysfunction, generally in the form of capsular restrictions. And for me, one of the best hip joint stretches that I've seen for this particular issue is a hip joint capsular stretch. And all you need to do here is if you can pop onto all fours. For me, I'm going to keep it consistent. I'm going to keep doing this right hand side. If we can take the opposite leg back, keeping your shoulders and your hips together, we're going to shift your body weight towards the side that you're trying to mobilize. And what we're looking for here is we want to imagine that your thigh bone is pushing out the back corner of your hip. It's a different feeling where it's not necessarily a muscular stretch. Essentially what we're looking for is a pressure type feeling in this area. There's a couple of different versions of it, but essentially you shouldn't feel like you have to tilt your hips and break that shoulder hip connection. Keep everything the same, come across parallel to the floor until you feel a gentle pressure at the side of your hips. You may need to shift your hands across here, and you've got a couple of different options. We can just gently oscillate in and out of that end range, or again, we can find that version of tightness where I've come across, and for me, I've come down a little bit more into that hip flexion, and I just want to hang out here for 30 seconds to 60 seconds. Again, imagining that my thigh bone is pressing out the back corner of my hip, because once you spent 30 seconds or a minute in this position, we can get you to come back to the middle again. Then with your right foot or the side that you're trying to stretch, we can externally rotate that leg, bring it into the middle, drop the other leg down to block that. And then we can repeat the same process again. We're going to come across, maybe back a little bit. We're going looking for some pressure that you might now feel into your butt a little bit more. All we're doing here is by changing our thigh position or our leg position, we're just trying to bias different parts of that hip joint capsule to make sure that we're not missing anything that could be restricted, that could eventually be causing those groin muscles to be tight. Again, once you spent 30 seconds, 60 seconds, a minute in this position, you can come back to the middle. And then the final piece is we want to take your foot outwards this time into an internally rotated position, then making sure that we do the same thing again. Now, for this particular one, you may feel it a little bit more through the front or to the side. If you feel anything in the groin, again, which is a dead giveaway that your hip joint might be impinging a little bit and asking that groin tissue to be tight, if that is you, as you come across, don't be as deep into hip flexion as you could be. Just come out of it a little bit more and you should find it takes some of the tension off that position. Same deal, spending 30 seconds, a minute, 2 minutes in this position, just respectfully asking that thigh bone to press out the backside of that hip. And then once you spend all the time in the world doing that, then immediately we want to come back to the same position that we had before. Up nice and tall, keep your back straight, hinge forward from your hips. And again, for me, I feel like I'm going down that little bit further, or a lot further actually than I was before. Again, there's still that little bit of residual tightness, but it just feels like I've now got more permission to drop forwards through my hip without running into that tight groin tissue at the same time. And again, let me know down in the comments how you found that was. This might also be a little bit surprising that the reason why your groin muscle is tight isn't because of a groin muscle issue, but because the joint that it crosses and the joint that it has a strong influence over is also restricted in its own right. So by freeing up your back and freeing up your hip joints, we might be getting to two of the underlying reasons behind why that groin might be tight in the first place. But as I mentioned before, if we're trying to permanently loosen groin muscle tightness, we need to go through a groin muscle stretch as well. So the best way that I've found clinically to stretch tight groin muscles isn't so much a specific stretch, but a concept. So I'll do this stretch while sitting on the floor because it's convenient to me. If you find getting down on the floor is a little bit tricky, you can definitely do this standing by putting your foot up onto something. But it's the concept behind what we're trying to look for while doing this, and then what we do once we're in the stretch that can be so powerful for this particular exercise. So how it looks, and surprise, surprise, it isn't too dissimilar to the initial test that we've been doing. We just want your leg out onto sort of a 45-degree angle. Again, if you're standing, you want your leg out to that same direction. Feet pointing up. You can squeeze your quad muscles, being up nice and tall, squeeze your glutes. And then we want to hinge forward as far as you feel happy to go. Again, you can support yourself with your hand. But what I want you to do here is obviously want to pay attention to where you feel your tightness. But what we can do is we can rotate your trunk around to see what the best angle is that captures the tightness that you need to capture. Because once you've found that, and for me, this direction feels the most accessible to my groin muscle tightness, what I need you to do here is I need you to squeeze that tight musculature. So squeeze your butt, squeeze your quads, tense up that inner thigh muscle for 5 to 10 seconds. The idea here is that once you stop tensing it while maintaining this position, it creates a reflex in your brain that prompts that tissue to immediately relax to some degree straight away. And then what should happen is I should then have that little bit more range that I can work in straight away. I've taken up more of the slack. I want to squeeze everything again, hold that for 5 to 10 seconds, give my brain a chance to get to work. Maximal contraction is followed by maximal relaxation, and then I should be able to go that little bit further and further again and keep repeating that process. So regardless of whether you feel like this position is comfortable for you, whether you want to do that standing with your foot up on something and still leaning forwards, all we're looking for is a position that captures that groin muscle tightness the best for you in the most convenient and safe way possible. But it doesn't matter what shape you're getting into or what position you're in to do that. Once you've found that tightness, you have to actively tense that musculature up to create that reflex, that PNF stretching or that contract relax stretching, to prompt that tissue to immediately give that little bit so that you can go further into the stretch and keep repeating that process until you either get sick of it or you've stopped making change. And then again, once I've come back to this same position again, being up nice and tall, hinging forwards, again, I now feel like I'm going a lot further than what I was before. But again, as I mentioned at the top of the video, if we aren't going looking for those hidden restrictions or that hidden dysfunction in your lower back, or some of those hidden restrictions through your hip joint, we potentially aren't pairing up your groin muscle stretches with the things that caused it in the first place. And again, as I mentioned at the top of the video, obviously mobility seems to be one of the main things to work on to improve your mobility, but also strengthening those areas, strengthening your lower back, strengthening your hips, strengthening your groin muscles, can also be a tangible way at asking that tissue to function better and not necessarily need to be as tight as it could be. Simple exercises that you could try are things like planks for your core muscle strength, clams for your hip muscle strength, any type of adductor groin strength exercise that you want to do on top of that, like an adductor plank, or some banded adduction. So with all that being said, there's one last piece of the puzzle that I'd like to talk about that hopefully paints the best picture for why we're having this conversation in the first place. So if you have found that freeing up specific sections of your spine does in fact loosen up your groin tissue, and freeing up a stiff hip joint does loosen up your groin tissue, we also need to ask the question of why are those two areas tight and stiff in their own right? So for me clinically, as someone really passionate about trying to take away as much mystery from things as possible, the number one cause that I consistently come across for most people is it often relates back to the shapes and the postures that you might leave your spine in the most throughout the day. And again, if you've been a fan of the channel, you'll have heard this a million times, but we want to pay attention to the less active, less interesting moments and look more at the ones where you're just stuck in a position for hours on end. Now, depending on your life and how it's structured, that could be sitting at a desk. It could be driving. It could be standing, bending over a certain shape at work. It can be sitting on the couch watching TV. It can be a position that you find you get into having a coffee with your friend every day. The point being is that if a certain part of your back has become stiff, tight, and dysfunctional, and even on one side more than the other, it's very likely that that could be the part of your back that you hinge through and relax through without actually noticing. And over time, that can build up and build up and build up and set off this chain reaction of events where, because your spine is becoming dysfunctional, any part of your body that relies on that section of your spine to be normal itself, i.e. your groin tissue, may then be dragged into this conversation unnecessarily and held there until we can get to the root source, underlying cause of that tightness and improve that. So it goes without saying, if you do come to the conclusion that some of the shapes that you're getting into unknowingly force you to hinge through that part of your back, then it makes sense that in order to change this, we need to try and get you out of that into a more optimal spinal shape more often. And the interesting thing about the hip restrictions is that the number one cause of restrictions in your hip often comes back to sitting as well. If you're stuck in the same hip position consistently day after day, week after week, then that may start to explain why you're lacking some of that important rotational and general hip range of motion, that when you take that away and improve that, it has a positive influence on your groin tissue. So again, if there's a situation where you find you are sitting a fair bit and you have the opportunity to stand up a little bit more or replace your sitting station with a standing station, we need to have these conversations if we truly want to get you to the stage where you can permanently loosen those tight groin muscles. Because again, I will say it consistently, everything has to happen for a reason. And if you don't have a valid reason in your head that when you change that reason, you see a tangible change in the thing that you care about, then we are missing something. It may not be intuitively obvious. It is most likely something in the background that this modern world has given to us. But like all the videos that I'm doing in this series, we need to look more broadly than just where you feel your tightness is. And if you've gone through each of these permanently loosened videos, you'll notice that there is a common theme amongst that. So I genuinely hope that this was insightful and helpful. Let me know in the comments down below which one of those exercises gave you the best bang for your buck in terms of loosening up your groin tissue. And if you can have a think about where you might find that your spine or your hip is becoming stiff and tight. Remember, it's less likely to be the active, interesting things because you're always moving through space. It's more likely to be the sedentary, stationary shapes that you're distracted from based on the things that we need to do day to day. But if you do go on to enjoy the video and find it useful, please let me know by leaving a like on the video. Subscribe to the channel if you want to see more of these types of videos. It's a great support to me. It helps me grow. But as always, with that being said, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.